There's a unique kind of exhaustion that comes from living inside a mind that never stops. For people who overthink everything, the world is not just a place to experience, it becomes a place to decode, analyze, predict, and control. And while overthinking often comes from a place of intelligence, awareness, and caution, it slowly becomes a cage, one where possibilities shrink and fears expand. Overthinkers don't lack ability, they don't lack potential. What they lack is mental clarity, because every decision becomes a battlefield. A simple thought becomes a puzzle. A small concern becomes a catastrophe. And the mind, instead of being an engine of progress, turns into a loop of hesitation. People who overthink are not weak. In fact, they are often some of the strongest and sharpest individuals. They feel deeply, they observe carefully, and they want to make the right decisions. But that desire to avoid mistakes becomes the very thing that steals their peace. The mind starts asking endless questions. What if I'm wrong? What if I fail? What if they misunderstand me? What if I'm not enough? Overthinking is not about a lack of answers. It's about drowning in too many answers. And in that noise, confidence fades, opportunities pass, and life becomes something that happens later, never now. But here's the truth. Overthinking is not your identity. It's a habit. And habits can be unlearned. The mind is incredibly powerful, but it follows the patterns you feed it. When you constantly rehearse fear, it becomes automatic. When you constantly replay past mistakes, they become present anchors. When you let imagined scenarios dominate your reality, the real world stops receiving your energy. Overthinking does not change what will happen. It only destroys your ability to respond when it does. Clarity comes from action, not from endless analysis. Growth comes from movement, not mental paralysis. People who overthink everything must understand one simple shift. Your thoughts are not instructions. They are suggestions. And you choose which suggestions to follow. If you can question your doubts as much as you question your dreams, everything changes. If you can interrupt the loop with a simple act, taking a step, making a call, starting the task, you break the cycle. Progress silences fear faster than reassurance does. Action rewires the mind faster than overthinking ever will. The goal is not to eliminate thoughts, it's to direct them. It's to teach your mind that not every fear deserves attention and not every scenario deserves rehearsal. And the moment you begin doing that, you reclaim your power. You stop being a prisoner of imagined outcomes and start becoming the author of real ones. Overthinking does not disappear overnight, but it loses control when you stop feeding it. When you choose presence over prediction, when you choose courage over caution, when you choose to live instead of waiting for the perfect moment. Because the perfect moment does not come from thinking, it comes from doing. People who overthink everything are capable of extraordinary things once they allow themselves to move, to trust, to release the need for absolute certainty. You don't need the whole staircase to take the first step. You don't need the entire plan to begin. You just need to stop giving your doubts a microphone and start giving your actions a chance. Life gets lighter when you stop carrying the weight of every what if. And the world opens up when you finally step out of your mind and into your life. Overthinking turns the mind from a tool of progress into a loop of hesitation and self-doubt. And this transformation happens quietly, almost invisibly, until you find yourself questioning things that never needed questioning in the first place. The mind is designed to analyze, to evaluate, to help you make informed choices, but when that natural process becomes excessive, it stops being helpful and starts becoming a barrier that stands between you and the life you want to live. Overthinking magnifies every thought, stretching tiny concerns into heavy burdens, taking simple moments and turning them into emotional puzzles that drain your energy. What could have been a step forward becomes a pause, then a delay, then a complete freeze, because the mind keeps looping through possibilities that may never even happen. Instead of giving you clarity, it surrounds you with endless scenarios and imagined outcomes, none of which bring peace or direction. In this constant mental loop, confidence begins to fade because each thought is met with another thought that questions it, and then another that doubts it. You start second-guessing your decisions, your instincts, your abilities, until even the smallest choice feels overwhelming. Overthinking makes you believe that every move you make carries enormous consequences, so you hesitate, thinking that if you analyze a little more, you'll eventually find the perfect answer. But the truth is that perfection never arrives through excessive thinking, it only becomes more distant. The more you overthink, the more you detach from action, and action is the only thing that brings clarity. Without action, thoughts multiply and collide, creating a fog that makes everything feel uncertain. Overthinking also feeds on fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of being judged, fear of disappointing others, fear of the unknown. It uses these fears like fuel, cycling them through your mind until they feel real and urgent. A simple message becomes a source of anxiety, a small task becomes a mountain, a conversation becomes a script you rehearse repeatedly, even though life never follows those rehearsed lines. In this state, your mind becomes a battlefield, not because you are weak or incapable, but because you care too deeply about getting everything right. And yet, the harder you try to think your way into certainty, the more uncertainty you create inside yourself. It becomes a paradox. You overthink because you want control, but the more you overthink, the less control you actually feel. Then there is the emotional exhaustion that comes from carrying mental loops for too long. Overthinking drains you mentally, physically, emotionally. It keeps you awake at night, replaying conversations, imagining outcomes, dissecting moments that are already gone. It keeps you distracted during the day, pulling your attention away from the present and into hypothetical futures. It convinces you that everything needs a deeper examination, when in reality most moments simply need to be lived. You start missing out. Not because opportunities disappear, but because your energy is consumed by possibilities instead of realities. The mind becomes loud, heavy, crowded, and yet none of that noise leads to progress. It simply keeps you stuck in a cycle that feels endless. Slowly, without realizing it, overthinking trains your brain to associate decisions with fear instead of confidence, and the more you respond with hesitation, the stronger that association becomes. Your mind adapts to the pattern of pausing, doubting, analyzing, and replaying until it feels like your natural state. But deep down, you know the truth. The moment you stop looping and start doing, even if it's one small step, the fog lifts a little. Clarity returns not because you solved every scenario in your mind, but because you moved, and movement always teaches you more than analysis ever will. Overthinkers are often highly intelligent and deeply aware individuals, and this heightened awareness becomes both their greatest strength and their quietest struggle. They notice details others overlook. They pick up on subtle emotional cues, they sense shifts in tone, energy, and intention, and they carry an inner desire to make the best possible choices in every situation. But this strength gradually turns into a mental burden when the desire for perfection becomes a trap that tightens around their thoughts. Instead of allowing their intelligence to guide them forward, they begin to use it against themselves, dissecting their own decisions, replaying interactions, and forecasting outcomes that never happened. It starts with wanting to get things right, but eventually becomes a fear of getting anything wrong. This fear shows up in small, everyday moments. A simple text message becomes a puzzle to analyze. A routine conversation becomes something to replay again and again. A decision that should take seconds turns into a long internal debate where every option is weighed, reweighed, and then doubted once more. Overthinkers don't struggle because they lack clarity, they struggle because they have too much of it. Their mind can imagine countless possibilities, each one layered with potential consequences, and instead of choosing one, they get stuck trying to avoid the possibility of choosing the wrong one. Their intelligence magnifies every scenario, and their sensitivity amplifies every emotion associated with it. The combination becomes overwhelming. The desire to be perfect in decision-making is often rooted in the fear of disappointing others or failing themselves. Overthinkers care deeply, sometimes too deeply, and that care turns into pressure. They want to avoid mistakes, avoid misunderstandings, avoid conflict, avoid letting anyone down, but the more they try to avoid these things, the more trapped they feel. Instead of moving forward freely, they begin tiptoeing through life, analyzing every step as if the ground beneath them might collapse. Their mind whispers possibilities, their heart remembers past moments, and both forces collide, creating a weight that slows everything down. In relationships, Overthinkers often worry about saying the wrong thing, doing too little, doing too much, or being misinterpreted. They replay conversations from days ago, analyzing how they came across, wondering if they should have phrased something differently. They read silence as a sign of disappointment, overanalyze short replies, and imagine worst-case scenarios even when nothing has gone wrong. Their intelligence allows them to see what others might be feeling, but their fear makes them doubt their own intuition. They want to be thoughtful, but they end up exhausting themselves with possibilities that never needed attention. In their professional life, overthinkers frequently struggle with decision-making, not because they lack solutions, but because they generate too many. They hesitate to take bold steps because boldness feels risky. They hesitate to speak up because they fear being judged. They hesitate to act because their mind demands one more moment of analysis. Their potential is evident, but their perfectionism becomes a barrier that blocks their progress. They aim for flawless outcomes, but flawless outcomes don't exist. And yet their mind refuses to accept that truth easily. This trap of perfection creates an internal pressure that builds silently. Overthinkers often appear calm on the outside, thoughtful, careful, composed, but inside they are carrying mental storms, questions, doubts, fears, what-ifs, possibilities, predictions, and memories all blending together. They are not indecisive by nature. They are overwhelmed by options. They are not slow, they are cautious. They are not weak, they are overly responsible, believing that every choice has a ripple effect they must anticipate and control. This constant responsibility wears them down, making even simple decisions feel like heavy obligations. And yet, beneath all these layers lies a truth overthinkers often forget. Their intelligence is meant to guide them, not imprison them. Their awareness is meant to empower them, not overwhelm them. Their care is meant to deepen connections, not create emotional pressure. The trap begins to loosen the moment they realize that life doesn't reward perfection, it rewards presence, courage, and the willingness to move even when the outcome is not guaranteed. Overthinking doesn't prevent problems. It only steals clarity, confidence, and peace from the present moment, creating a life where the mind is constantly preparing for battles that may never arrive. People often believe that by thinking more, planning more, anticipating more, they are somehow protecting themselves from future pain or failure. But the truth is that overthinking builds walls, not shields. It doesn't equip you for what's ahead, it exhausts you before you even get there. When your mind is constantly occupied with potential problems, imagined scenarios, and hypothetical outcomes, you lose the ability to experience the moment you're actually living in. Instead of using your energy to respond to what's real, you spend your energy responding to what's imaginary. This constant mental preparation creates a false sense of control, as if thinking hard enough can guarantee a safe and perfect future. But the more you try to predict the future, the more uncertain it actually feels. Overthinking makes the unknown look bigger, darker, and more threatening than it really is. A small worry becomes a heavy weight, a minor challenge becomes a catastrophe, and a temporary setback becomes a permanent barrier in the mind. You start to believe that something is always about to go wrong, even when everything is fine. The mind rehearses fear in the hope of avoiding it, but this rehearsal only strengthens anxiety. It trains the brain to expect danger, even in moments that are completely safe. Clarity fades because the mind becomes crowded with too many thoughts, many of which contradict each other. One thought tells you to move forward, another tells you to wait, another warns you of risks, another creates doubt about your ability, and you end up standing still, pulled in every direction and moving in none. Confidence disappears because every decision feels uncertain, every step feels risky, and every possibility feels like a potential mistake. Instead of trusting your judgment, you start questioning your intuition. Instead of listening to your inner wisdom, you start listening to your inner fear. And when fear becomes the voice you pay the most attention to, everything feels overwhelming. The present moment feels heavy and distant because your mind is rarely there. You're either replaying the past or worrying about the future. You're analyzing old conversations, imagining new problems, or trying to solve situations you haven't even encountered yet. This mental time travel steals your ability to feel grounded. You miss out on the beauty, peace, and simplicity of now because your mind is too busy trying to fix later. Overthinking makes you feel like you're working hard, but emotionally you're standing still. You're mentally busy, but not mentally fulfilled. You're overprepared for a reality that may never happen. And underengaged with the reality that's right in front of you. Emotionally, overthinking takes a quiet but powerful toll. It drains your energy without you noticing it. It creates mental fatigue that shows up in your body as tension, restlessness, headaches, and exhaustion. It makes you feel distant in relationships even when you care deeply because your mind is always preoccupied. It makes you feel overwhelmed at work even when you're capable because your thoughts are scattered. It makes you feel disconnected from yourself because you're constantly responding to fear instead of responding to truth. The greatest illusion overthinking creates is the belief that thinking more will somehow create certainty. But certainty doesn't come from thinking. It comes from clarity, presence, and courage. The moment you let go of the need to predict everything, you make room for the ability to handle anything. The moment you stop analyzing what could go wrong, you rediscover what could go right. And the moment you stop overthinking the future, you begin to reclaim the moments that make life meaningful. Thoughts are suggestions, not commands. And action breaks the cycle of overthinking faster than reassurance ever will because the mind can only argue with ideas, never with experience. When someone is caught in the loop of overthinking, every thought feels urgent, important, and authoritative, as if the mind is delivering absolute truths instead of possibilities. A thought appears, and instead of examining it, you accept it as a warning. Another thought appears, and you treat it like a prediction. Soon you're surrounded by a storm of mental suggestions that begin to feel like instructions you must obey. But thoughts have no power until you give them power. They are simply signals, fragments, and interpretations created by the brain. Some are helpful, others are rooted in fear, past experiences, or insecurities, and they don't deserve the authority they're given. Overthinkers often forget that they can question their thoughts the same way they question their decisions. Just because your mind says you will fail doesn't mean failure is coming. Just because your mind imagines a negative outcome doesn't mean the outcome is real. Yet overthinking gives these thoughts weight, replaying them until they feel true. The mind becomes a storyteller and fear becomes the author. Every scenario becomes a cautionary tale, every decision becomes a risk, and every opportunity becomes something to analyze rather than embrace. But when you recognize that thoughts are suggestions, you create distance between what you think and what you choose. You learn to observe without absorbing, to notice without surrendering. Reassurance, although comforting in the moment, rarely ends the loop of overthinking. You can tell yourself 100 times that everything will be fine, but if your behavior doesn't change, the mind will simply find another angle to worry about. Reassurance tries to soften fear, but action dismantles it. When you act, even in small ways, you show your mind evidence that challenges the fear. If your mind says you can't do something and you do it anyway, the fear loses its foundation. If your mind says disaster is coming and you take a step that goes well, the anxiety weakens. Action creates real-life feedback that overpowers imagined worries. The brain learns from experience, not from endless thinking. This is why progress often feels easier once you start moving. The moment you take a step, even if it's imperfect, your focus shifts from imagination to reality. The mind becomes quieter because it has less space to fill with hypothetical outcomes. Clarity grows because action simplifies your choices. Instead of analyzing 10 different possibilities, you deal with what's right in front of you. You respond to real challenges, not imagined ones. And with every action you take, confidence slowly rebuilds. Not because you figured everything out, but because you prove to yourself that you can handle what comes next. Breaking the cycle of overthinking doesn't require anything dramatic. It requires a shift from debating your thoughts to directing them. It requires choosing movement over mental paralysis. It requires understanding that your mind will always generate suggestions, some useful, some useless, but you are the one who decides which ones to follow. You can acknowledge fear without obeying it. You can feel uncertainty without freezing. You can hear the doubts but still take a step forward. When you treat your thoughts as suggestions, you regain control. You stop being dragged by mental noise and start acting based on intention. You stop waiting for the perfect moment and start creating moments through your actions. You stop giving fear the authority to shape your life and start giving your choices the power to shape your reality. And once you experience even a small victory created by action, the mind begins to trust movement more than worry, direction more than doubt, and your life slowly shifts from overthinking to living life becomes lighter and more empowered when you stop feeding what ifs and start trusting small decisive steps, because every what if is a thought rooted in fear, but every step is an action rooted in possibility. Overthinkers often imagine danger in every direction, believing that by thinking through every potential outcome, they are somehow preparing themselves for the future. But the future isn't shaped by imagined scenarios, it's shaped by the choices you make here and now. When you spend your energy feeding what ifs, you invest your mind into predictions that rarely come true, and even when they do, the fear surrounding them often turns out to be far worse than the moment itself. The mind exaggerates uncertainty, and because it cannot tolerate unpredictability, it fills the empty spaces with worry. What if thinking creates a psychological fog that makes life feel heavier than it needs to be? It stops you from taking action, because every option feels dangerous, even the ones that could help you grow. You start questioning your abilities, your decisions, your relationships, and even your dreams. Instead of seeing opportunities, you see obstacles. Instead of imagining progress, you imagine failure. This constant anticipation of negative outcomes drains your energy and prevents you from experiencing the fullness of the present moment. The weight of assumptions begins to feel like the weight of reality, even though nothing has actually happened. You start living in a future that exists only in your mind, while the real world waits for you to engage with it. But the moment you shift from feeding what ifs to taking small intentional steps, everything changes. Action grounds you. It brings you back into the present, giving your mind less space to wander into fear. It reminds you that you don't need to solve the entire journey at once. You only need to move one step at a time. Small steps create momentum, and momentum creates confidence. You begin to see that progress does not require certainty. It requires willingness. You don't need to know how everything will unfold. You only need to trust that you can adjust along the way. Every step you take weakens the power of fear and strengthens the voice of intuition. The world feels less overwhelming because you're no longer trying to control it all at once. Taking decisive steps doesn't mean acting without thinking. It means refusing to let overthinking be the reason you don't act. It means acknowledging your fears but not surrendering to them. It means realizing that courage isn't the absence of fear, but movement despite it. You can feel unsure and still step forward. You can feel unprepared and still begin. You can feel anxious and still give yourself permission to try. These small choices reshape the way your mind functions. They teach your brain that action is safe, that movement brings clarity, and that you are capable of navigating challenges without needing to predict every detail beforehand. And as you continue taking these steps, life begins to feel lighter because you're no longer carrying the weight of imagined outcomes. You start noticing that most of the things you feared never actually happen, and even when challenges arise, they are rarely as overwhelming as your mind made them seem. You start trusting your ability to respond, adapt, and learn. The present moment becomes richer because your attention is no longer scattered across countless hypothetical futures. You become more grounded, more resilient, and more connected to yourself. Life becomes less about controlling and more about experiencing. You begin to move with a sense of freedom because you're no longer held hostage by the endless cycle of what if, and instead you're guided by the steady rhythm of small steps that build strength, clarity, and confidence within you.